Hi, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Hester and Emily and Alex to organize this talk tonight in relation to the current exhibition, The Lives of Documents, Photography as a Project. My practice, I often revisit places that hold memories and personal narratives from Korea, and I create projects to reestablish their relevance to the present. So today I'll be focusing on one of the materials that I use quite often in my work, which is found domestic objects. This work that you're looking at is called The Objects on the Rooftop. This work was started by examining the objects and the house in South Korea that belonged to my paternal grandparents. At the time, I wanted to establish a connection to this house, reflecting on my status as someone returning from afar. As a young adult, I had a strong desire to create a work that could somehow express my personal heritage and the connection to this particular house, which I considered a symbol of home and belonging. I created a pile on the rooftop of the house using objects from their basement, things that were out of use and being stored. The idea of creating a pile came from observing moving piles on pickup trucks around South Korea. Looking at the collection of objects that belong to strangers stimulated my imagination beyond their physical qualities, and I became interested in their transient structure as an enduring grounding existence while in motion. So those are some of the examples of the pickup trucks that are very commonly used in South Korea. Actually, now they're not using them that kind of way, not as much. They're changing it to using the trailers more often, but those are still being seen. So returning to the project Objects on the Rooftop, I will share with you an excerpt from a short text that I wrote while working on this project back in 2014. So it's an old project, it's one of my early work. The objects. They occupy every corner like quiet guardians of the place. These objects are the inhabitants of this house. Piles of clothing, boxes, and fabrics quietly tucked in the corners of the rooms. Dysfunctional electronics, drawers that don't open properly, books and photographs lying and hanging about in the interior. The things are caught in their own static time loops, existing in between neglect and maintenance. The objects are piled up on top of each other with a system, but their reasoning is not obvious to the outsider. They may seem abandoned at first, but upon observation, I realize that each of them is in its own perfect zone. They are in a prolonged state of permanence with endurance against the condition of precarity. They will be there if the house stands on this ground, if their stubborn owner keeps them alive. It is disorienting to realize that I am only a visitor after all, no matter how strongly I feel attached to the idea of this house. The house is familiar and foreign to me at the same time. That's the end of the text. As a person who returns from far away, visiting one's quote-unquote origin, often one looks at things through something like an anthropologist's gaze, foraging evidences and remnants of the recognizable past, and collecting things without fully understanding their roles and context. I am aware of this perspective that I inevitably embody every time I go back to South Korea to make projects, and it complicates my relationship with the things that I see and encounter there. This text is about the sense of estrangement to what is supposed to be part of my own history. In the case of the piles that I created on the rooftop of the house, they represent my selfish endeavor to reflect upon my own status in relation to my grandparents' place. I used objects that were stored indefinitely in the basement, thinking through their oscillating status as relics of the past and their suspended present. I projected my own instability onto them. I was working on a project about a disappearing neighborhood in South Korea. Years later, I encountered similar piles again in the areas that are on the brink of demolition. In the case of the Jugong apartment series, which I worked on between 2016 to 2019, this was a photographic series documenting multiple disappearing apartment complexes on the outskirts of Seoul. I photographed the process of the demolition, and during the process, I photographed also the things that were left behind by the former residents in the parking lots of these residential areas. The piles were neatly gathered, waiting for a trip to the recycling or garbage intake centers. As you can see, they were all sort of gathered in one place quite nicely. As I took photographs of them, those objects stood in as an abstraction of someone's everyday life. And the images of discarded furniture were interesting to me, not because the objects themselves are necessarily interesting, but because of their precarious and melancholic status in which they were being pictured. Such conditions resonated with me personally, but also stood as monuments for untold individual and collective stories of the place that is no longer. So those are the piles that I have found by walking through those areas, but also I have made this pile by dragging the objects that are scattered around, and then created this installation that could only be photographed, documented, and then shared as a photographic work. While looking at those piles of objects, another aspect that resonated with me is when furniture is in this situation, abandoned in piles outside, it appears to be self-sustaining. Often each element leans on or is leaned on. They are arranged in a way of fine balancing with the logic of gravity, preventing them from spilling over to the sidewalk. After dealing with these piles, my senses were alert to them, and I started noticing them actively around my surroundings in Seoul and in Montreal. I think Montreal is a city where I can easily access these piles on the curbside, which I find is part of Montreal's identity as a city. The proliferation of secondhand items and their appearance in public spaces is quite unique to this city and worth noticing. So those are some of the piles. I think most of you are sort of very used to seeing these things on the curbside, just maybe a day before the recycling collection day, and maybe in July when everyone is moving. And as I was preparing this talk, it occurred to me that for the first time I realized that I do not know which came first, the piles that I have seen on the sidewalk of Montreal or the piles that I made in South Korea. I guess it doesn't really matter. It's a hybrid process. So 1 year after completing the Jugong apartment series, the pandemic hit us in 2020. During the lockdown, like everyone else, making art project that required traveling abroad could not continue, so I was left without a project to work on. Also, I was not in the right mind to make the projects. About a year later, still deep into the lockdown and intercity movements restricted by the curfew, Montreal's Cuisine Taville Festival approached me with a space, Place des Festivals, and I pitched an idea of making an installation to them. The work was materialized in May of 2021. I will share with you the documentation video. My idea was to gather furniture and small objects from people who are ready to move away from the city and make a pile that in some ways emulate the piles that I have encountered in South Korea and in Montreal. I wanted to make a kind of mimetic double to the piles from my past encounters. These objects were gathered from people's donations and from the sidewalks, as well as some from my own waste. Some of the materials being used in these installations are found furniture, laminated photographs, light elements, organic elements such as dried food residues, rooted potatoes, soil, used bricks, concrete, wood, rocks, screws, synthetic strings, and shattered glass pieces and mirrors. I imagined that the collection and arrangement of these objects would make the pile a living one, or the lived one, in which it does not merely wait to be perished, but perhaps could be approached as a melancholic structure that breathes. The fact that it will be in Place des Festival was interesting to me for this idea, as it will give it a chance to stage something peripheral into a city's centers as a spectacle. The everyday as a spectacle made sense to me, especially back then, because that's pretty much what everyone else was doing, including myself, and it was being relentlessly consumed on social media, which I consider a public space. In a sense, the work brought forward what is invisible into visible abstraction, hopefully in a relatable way. In terms of method, what this installation has extracted from the piles that I have encountered in the past are the aesthetics of spontaneous assemblage and the idea of balancing. One of the anecdotes that I can share is the installation was outside for the 4 days. And one of those days, there was a very strong rainstorm. And I was very proud that nothing was tipped over. And I was able to anchor everything down quite tightly. And in a way, it was interesting to be making something that looks very precarious to hold it, to be held in a place quite solidly. In the context in which it was exhibited, which is in the city of Montreal in the downtown core at Place des Festival, the abstraction of everyday and seemingly precarious arrangement of the objects becomes metaphorical to the condition of unsettledness, the disruption of daily lives under any number of reasons, such as housing crisis, international visa problems, increased exodus from urban centers, mental health issues, and a deferred sense of reality due to the pandemic's lockdown. Such various precarious conditions that are sustaining and in their way secured as a living system via temporary job arrangements that get switched over, constant moving due to rent increases and having to create life by discarding belongings and having to buy new ones. These objects were gathered from people's donations, mostly through an internet posting on a Korean community website and from the sidewalks. Recreating the aesthetics of the piles and staging it in the public space was a gesture that could acknowledge the presence of such a prevalent sense of precarity, exteriorly and interiorly. I consider looking at those piles in the public space as one of the many but early symptoms of subversion of the everyday. This installation for me on a personal level was to create a point of convergence between the two places, the past and the present. The installation inserted photographs from my personal phone pictures that were mainly documenting moments of everyday routines and during the pandemic walks. It was to create a sense of identification that could expand on its ability to activate the viewer's imagination. Another visual element that I used is multiple mirrors as part of the assemblages, and they were set up so that their reflections are creating mise en abîme, a frame within a frame. The mirrors were precisely placed to be reflecting the photographs at a viewpoint that is not readily seen by the viewer at a normal angle without the presence of the mirror. In this way, I wanted the experience of looking at the seemingly insignificant objects as a process of discovery, some kind of mind game where you can also at one point see yourself in it. Also, the mirror reflections become images in themselves, pointing back to the surrounding, in this context, the Place des Festival. To wrap up, the way I am developing my methodologies regarding objects is, on the first level, rooted in the unreasonable, inexplainable attraction to the discarded and crumbling objects. It is perhaps a mirror stage impulse where I am looking at for looking for a piece of physical clue that can look back and be recognizable of my own memories. Such a process of identification happens involuntarily, and my way of paying attention to it is to take photographs. Such accumulative threads of identification are significant since they bring things into the present, however far away the past is in geographic distances and in cultural dissonances. It is a process in which I am keep surrendering myself to clearly see my present sense of place and identity. Thank you.